Okay, how's it going, everybody? So we're going to read this first book of on war, which is on the nature of war, and chapter 1, which is what is war. And so there's 5 sections here. We're going to go ahead and read all 5 of these sections. Well, there's actually more, but this particular time, we're going to read the first 5 sections. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this. This is chapter 1. What is war? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the first one here is introduction. We propose to consider first the single elements of our subject, then each branch or part, and last of all, the whole in all its relations, therefore to advance from the simple to the complex. But it is necessary for us to commence with a glance at the nature of the whole, because it is particularly necessary that in the consideration of any of the parts, the relation to the whole should be kept constantly in view. Okay, so this is section 2, definition. We shall not enter into any of the abstruse definitions of war used by publicists. We shall keep to the element of the thing itself, to a duel. War is nothing but a duel on an extensive scale. If we would conceive as a unit the countless number of duels which make up a war, we shall do so best by supposing to ourselves 2 wrestlers. Each strives by physical force to compel the other to submit to his will. Each endeavors to throw his adversary and thus render him incapable of further resistance. War, therefore, is an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. Violence arms itself with the inventions of art and science in order to contend against violence. Self-imposed restriction, almost imperceptible and hardly worth mentioning, termed usages of international law, accompany it without essentially impairing its power. Violence, that is to say physical force, for there is no moral force without the conception of states and law, is therefore the means. The compulsory submission of the enemy to our will is the ultimate object. In order to attain this object fully, the enemy must be disarmed, and disarmament becomes therefore the immediate object of hostilities in theory. It takes the place of the final object and puts it aside as something we can eliminate from our calculations. 3. Utmost use of force. Now, philanthropists may easily imagine there is a skillful method of disarming and overcoming an enemy without great bloodshed, and that this is the proper tendency of the art of war. However plausible this may appear, still it is an error which must be extirpated, for in such dangerous things as war, the errors which proceed from a spirit of benevolence are the worst, as the use of physical power to the utmost extent by no means excludes the cooperation of the intelligence. It follows that he who uses force unsparingly, without reference to the bloodshed involved, must obtain a superiority if his adversary uses less vigor in its application. The former then dictates the law to the latter, and both proceed to extremities, to which the only limitations are those imposed by the amount of counteracting force on each side. This is the way in which the matter must be viewed, and it is to no purpose. It is even against one's own interests to turn away from the consideration of the real nature of the affair, because the horror of its elements excites repugnance. If the wars of civilized people are less cruel and destructive than those of savages, the difference arises from the social condition both of states in themselves and in their relations to each other. Out of the social condition and its relations, war arises, and by it, war is subjected to conditions, is controlled and modified. But these things do not belong to war itself. They are only given conditions. And to introduce into the philosophy of war itself a principle of moderation would be an absurdity. 2 motives lead men to war: instinctive hostility and hostile intention. In our definition of war, we have chosen as its characteristic the latter of these elements, because it is the most general. It is impossible to conceive the passion of hatred of the wildest description, bordering on mere instinct, without combining with it the idea of hostile intention. On the other hand, hostile intentions may often exist without being accompanied by any, or at all events, by any extreme, hostility of feeling. Amongst savages, views emanating from the feelings; amongst civilized nations, those emanating from the understanding, have the predominance. But this difference arises from attendant circumstances, existing institutions, and therefore is not to be found necessarily in all cases, although it prevails in the majority. In short, even the most civilized nations may burn with passionate hatred of each other. We may see from this what a fallacy it would be to refer the war of a civilized nation entirely to an intelligent act on the part of the government, and to imagine it as continually freeing itself more and more from an all feeling of passion in such a way that at last the physical masses of combatants would no longer be required. In reality, their mere relations would suffice, a kind of algebraic action. Theory was beginning to drift in the direction until the facts of the last war. Parentheses, Clausewitz alludes here to the wars of liberation, 1813, 14, and 15, end quote. Facts of the last war taught it better. If war is an act of force, it belongs necessarily also to the feelings. If it does not originate in the feelings, it reacts more or less upon them. And the extent of this reaction depends not on the degree of civilization, but upon the importance and duration of the interests involved. Therefore, if we find civilizations do not put their prisoners to death, do not devastate towns and countries, this is because their intelligence exercises greater influence on their mode of carrying on war, and has taught them more effectual means of applying force than these rude acts of mere instinct. The invention of gunpowder, the constant progress of improvements in the construction of firearms are sufficient proofs that the tendency to destroy the adversary which lies at the bottom of the conception of war is in no way changed or modified through the progress of civilization. We therefore repeat our proposition that war is an act of violence pushed to its utmost bounds. As one side dictates the law to the other, there arises a sort of reciprocal action, which logically must lead to an extreme. This is the first reciprocal action. And the first extreme, which we meet, first reciprocal action. So this is number 4. The aim is to disarm the enemy. We have already said that the aim of all action in war is to disarm the enemy, and we shall now show that this, theoretically at least, is indispensable. If our opponent is to be made to comply with our will, we must place him in a situation which is more oppressive to him than the sacrifice which we demand. But the disadvantages of this position must naturally not be of transitory nature, at least in appearance. Otherwise, the enemy, instead of yielding, will hold out in the prospect of a change for the better. Every change in this position, which is produced by a continuation of the war, would therefore be a change for the worse. The worst condition in which a belligerent can be placed is that of being completely disarmed. If, therefore, the enemy is to be reduced to submission by an act of war, he must either be positively disarmed or placed in such a position that he is threatened with it. From this it follows that the disarming or overthrow of the enemy, whichever we call it, must always be the aim of warfare. Now war is always the shock of two hostile bodies in collision, not the action of a living power upon an inanimate mass, because an absolute state of endurance would not be making war. Therefore, what we have just said as to the aim of action in war applies to both parties. Here then is another case of reciprocal action. As long as the enemy is not defeated, he may defeat me. Then I shall be no longer my own master. He will dictate the law to me as I did to him. This is the second reciprocal action and leads to a second extreme, second reciprocal action. 5. Utmost assertion of powers. If we desire to defeat the enemy, we must proportion our efforts to his powers of resistance. This is expressed by the product of two factors which cannot be separated, namely, the sum of available means and the strength of the will. The sum of the available means may be estimated in a measure, as it depends, although not entirely, upon numbers. But the strength of volition is more difficult to determine and can only be estimated to a certain extent by the strength of the motives. Granted, we have obtained in this way an approximation to the strength of the power to be contended with. We can then take of our own means, and either increase them so as to obtain a preponderance, or, in case we have not the resources to effect this, then do our best by increasing our means as far as possible. But the adversary does the same. Therefore, there is a new mutual enhancement, which in pure conception must create a fresh effort towards an extreme. This is the third case of reciprocal action, and a third extreme with which we meet. Third reciprocal action. Okay, so that's the first sections of Chapter 1, What is War, by General Clausewitz. So, in 1827. When we come back, we'll read the 6 through 10. And thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium. All of these are Marxists. Y'all have a great day. Dada Goe.